A snowstorm was coming to Brightwater Gap, but Nolan Rusk had already been living inside one. 3 months after losing his wife, the retired Navy SEAL only wanted boards, nails, and enough supplies to survive the cold. Then he saw an old German shepherd tied beneath a bare maple tree at the winter market. The dog's collar was worn, his muzzle was silver, but his eyes carried a memory Nolan could not ignore. Bracken was not just a retired K-9 looking for a home. He was the living thread between Nolan's lost wife, a forgotten town, and a promise hidden inside an old house. Stay with us, share where you're watching from, and if this story touches you, please like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Nolan Rusk had learned that a house could grieve. Not in the way people did. It did not kneel beside a grave or forget to eat or wake at 3 in the morning, reaching for a hand that was no longer there. But the old timber house on Harrow Mill Road had its own language of mourning. It sighed through the split window frame on the north side. It groaned beneath the weight of snow gathering on the porch roof. It let cold drafts move room to room like ghosts who had lost their manners. 3 months after Maren died, Nolan still had not fixed any of it. The hammer remained on the kitchen table where he had left it in October. The paint cans sat unopened near the back wall. A curtain Maren had meant to hem lay folded over a chair, pale blue cloth gathering dust as quietly as an unanswered letter. Outside, Brightwater Gap, Vermont, had dressed itself for winter with the solemn pride of an old mountain town. Snow rested on church steps, woodpiles, mailboxes, and the shoulders of black spruce trees. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin gray ribbons. From a distance, the town looked peaceful enough to be painted on a Christmas card. Up close, it was a place bracing for impact. The radio had been warning about the storm since dawn. Heavy accumulation, whiteout conditions, roads closing by nightfall, power outages likely. Nolan listened while standing at the kitchen sink, one hand around a mug of coffee gone cold. He was 52, tall and broad-shouldered, with the dense, weathered strength of a man who had once carried more than his own weight across bad terrain. His dark hair was cropped in a neat undercut, silver showing at both temples. Clean-shaven, blue-gray eyes. A face cut in hard lines, handsome in a way that seemed less like vanity and more like erosion. He wore an olive-drab combat shirt, its fitted torso faded from use, the camouflage sleeves marked with horizontal bands across the upper arms. It was practical, familiar, almost automatic. Some men kept old uniforms for pride. Nolan kept pieces of his because choosing civilian clothes required a kind of softness he had not yet recovered. The storm would not wait for grief to become convenient. So he made a list. Plywood, window sealant, nails, rope, lamp oil, batteries, canned soup, coffee, even though June Whitaker claimed his coffee tasted like something scraped from a truck axle. Maren would have agreed with her. That thought came so suddenly, Nolan had to set the mug down. For a moment, the kitchen seemed to fill with her almost laugh, not loud, never theatrical, just warm enough to make a room remember it had a heart. Maren used to lean against that counter in thick socks, hair coming loose from a knot, watching him measure boards too precisely for a house that had already survived 90 years by ignoring straight lines. "You know," she would say, "not every crooked thing is asking to be fixed." He had not known how to answer her then. He knew even less now. Nolan took his keys from the hook by the door and stepped out before the memory could pull him under. His old pickup coughed twice before starting. The heater complained, then surrendered a thin breath of warmth. He drove down the hill slowly, tires crunching over packed snow, the valley opening below in a sheet of white and pine shadow. He had avoided town as much as possible since the funeral. Brightwater Gap was not cruel. That made it worse. People there had the terrible kindness of neighbors who knew where the casseroles belonged and which porch steps were loose. They spoke softly around him. They touched his sleeve. They said Maren's name as if setting glass on a table. Nolan preferred silence. Silence did not pity him. The winter market had been set up along the square despite the coming storm. It was smaller than usual, a few farmers selling late apples from cold storage, a woman with knitted hats, a man sharpening tools beneath a canvas awning. The hardware store was open, its windows glowing amber against the blue-white morning. Nolan parked near the feed shop and sat a moment longer than necessary. Get in, buy the supplies, leave. A simple operation, the kind he should still be good at. He stepped out into the cold. Wind moved through the market, lifting loose snow from the ground and sending it spinning around boots and crates. Somewhere, a bell over a shop door kept ringing. A man laughed too loudly near the coffee stand. The smell of sawdust, wool, fried dough, and wood smoke folded together in the air. Nolan kept his head down. He was almost at the hardware store when he saw the dog. At the far edge of the market, beneath a leafless maple tree, an old man sat on a folding chair with his shoulders hunched inside a brown wool coat. A faded parka swallowed his narrow frame. A burgundy knit cap was pulled low over wisps of white hair. At his feet rested a small tin box, a canvas folder, and a hand-lettered sign propped against a crate. Rehoming Retired Service Dog Adoption. Fee. What you can give good home, only beside him sat a German shepherd. Not young, not polished. Not the glossy kind people imagined when they said brave dog and meant poster, not life. The shepherd's coat was black and deep gold, dulled by age and weather. His muzzle had gone silver, especially around the chin. One ear stood clean and sharp, the other had a small tear along the edge. He sat upright despite the cold, front paws placed evenly in the snow, amber-brown eyes tracking the market with quiet precision. Nolan stopped. People passed the old man without slowing much. A woman glanced at the sign and gave a sad smile before moving on. A man in a red jacket murmured, "Too old, not unkindly, but not quietly enough." The dog heard him. His ear flicked once. He did not move. Nolan felt something stir beneath his ribs. Not recognition yet. Something older than recognition. The body remembering before the mind gave permission. The way the dog watched the crowd. The way he held his weight. The way he did not beg, did not shrink, did not perform. A retired service dog, the sign said. But that collar was not ordinary. Nolan found himself crossing the snow before he had decided to do it. His boots stopped several feet away, respectful distance. The old man looked up. His eyes were pale blue and watery, but not empty. His hands trembled where they rested on his knees. "Morning," the old man said. His voice sounded like gravel in a tin cup. "Morning," Nolan answered. The shepherd's gaze shifted to him. Nolan did not reach out. He knew better. He let his arms hang loose, shoulders relaxed, breath steady. The dog's nose moved slightly, measuring him, sorting him from all the other smells in the square. Coffee, wool, oil, fear, meat, snow. "What's his name?" Nolan asked. "Bracken," the old man said. The name landed somewhere Nolan could not immediately see. Bracken. The dog blinked. Nolan looked at the collar. Old dark leather, cracked but cared for. A worn metal tag hung from one ring, the engraving nearly rubbed away. He could make out only part of it. B-17K. His pulse changed, not enough for anyone else to notice. Enough for the dog. Bracken's head tilted a fraction. Nolan lifted his right hand slowly, 2 fingers angled down, palm turned in. A small signal, almost nothing to anyone watching. A hold command from another life. Not a trick, not a pet command. Something used when sound could get men killed. Bracken's ears came forward, his body tightened. One front paw lifted, barely clearing the snow. The market noise seemed to fall back. The bell, the wind, the laughter, the scrape of a shovel on ice. All of it thinned until Nolan could hear only his own breathing and the soft, controlled breath of the dog beneath the maple tree. There it was. Not proof, Not yet. But a door in Nolan's memory had opened, and cold light was coming through. Years ago? Afghanistan. Red flare light over a valley. His team pinned in the dark after a route changed without warning. A K-9 unit brought in for a short joint operation, a shepherd moving low through dust and broken stone, guiding them past death hidden under the earth. Nolan had not known the dog long. Maybe 3 days. Maybe 4. Long enough to remember the way courage looked when it had 4 legs and no interest in applause. The old man watched Nolan's face carefully. "You know working dogs?" he asked. "I've known a few." "That's more than most folks who stop." The man gave a tired smile. "Most ask if he's good with cats, then remember they have somewhere else to be." Nolan's mouth almost moved toward a smile. Almost. "He yours?" he asked. The old man looked down at Bracken. His expression changed so gently that Nolan understood the answer before hearing it. "He's been mine for 6 years, the man said. "Or I've been his. Hard to tell with a dog like him." Bracken leaned slightly toward the old man's knee without taking his eyes off Nolan. "I'm Abner Pike," the man added. "Used to run the little repair shed off Mill Road, before my hands got ideas of their own." He lifted one trembling hand as if it belonged to a disobedient employee. "Doctors say I'm moving into assisted care up north." "Place won't take a shepherd," I argued. "Lost with dignity?" which is just a fancy way of saying I lost. A faint bitterness passed through the words, but affection softened it before it could sharpen. Nolan looked again at the sign. "You're not selling him." Abner's jaw tightened. "No. I'm trying not to fail him." That landed harder than Nolan expected. Abner reached for the canvas folder near his boot and fumbled with the clasp. Nolan stepped forward, then stopped, giving the dog time to accept the movement. Bracken did not flinch. His eyes followed Nolan's hand, but he stayed still. "Papers are in here," Abner said. "Adoption from a retired working dog program, vet records. Some pages got damp when my roof leaked last spring. His old file was already missing things when I got him. Government paperwork, you know, clear as mud and twice as heavy." Nolan crouched, taking the folder when Abner offered it. The pages smelled of paper, mildew, and old homes. Some ink had bled. Some forms were clean enough to read. Bracken's name appeared in block letters. There were vaccination dates, joint medication notes, a behavioral evaluation, and several lines of coded service history partially blacked out or water-damaged. Then Nolan saw a designation that made the past stand up inside him. Not complete, not clean, but close enough. He glanced at Bracken. The dog was watching him now, not as a stranger, but as a question. Nolan swallowed. "How much are you asking?" Abner's face tightened again, this time with embarrassment. "Whatever's fair. Enough so I know the person means it. Enough so some fool doesn't take him because free sounds easy." Nolan took out his wallet. He did not count carefully. If he had, he might have made it feel like a transaction. He folded several bills and placed them in Abner's hand. The old man stared. "That's too much." "It isn't for him," Nolan said. Abner looked up. "For your move," Nolan continued. "Medical costs, whatever they don't cover. You said you were trying not to fail him. Let me help you do that." For a second, Abner's face broke open with a grief so plain Nolan had to look away. There was no dignity in pretending love did not hurt. There was only the old human comedy of trying not to cry in public while sitting under a tree with a dog who already knew. Abner wiped at one eye with the heel of his hand. "Well," he said roughly, "you look hard to live with." Nolan looked at him. Abner nodded toward the dog. "But Bracken's no picnic either. Maybe you two can disappoint each other evenly." A sound escaped Nolan then. Small, rusted, almost a laugh. Bracken's tail moved once against the snow. Abner unclipped the leash from the tree and held it a moment longer than necessary. His thumb rubbed the leather where years of use had darkened it. "He doesn't like shouting," Abner said. "Metal banging spooks him. Thunder, too, though he'll pretend otherwise because he's proud as a bishop. His left hip gets stiff when the cold settles in. He'll take pills if you hide them in sausage, but he'll look offended first." "I can manage that." "He doesn't trust quick hands." "Neither do I." Abner nodded, as if that answered more than the words themselves. Then he leaned down, slow and careful, and pressed his forehead to Bracken's. The old shepherd closed his eyes. The market went on around them. Boots, bells, wind, voices, commerce, ordinary hunger. But under the maple tree, time lowered its head. "You go on now, old soldier," Abner whispered. "This man looks like he forgot how to come back from somewhere. Maybe you remember the road." Bracken opened his eyes. Nolan felt the sentence move through him like a blade turned sideways, not cutting exactly, but finding the space between ribs. He took the leash. Bracken did not resist. He did not rush either. He rose slowly, his hind legs stiff for the first step, then steadier. Snow clung to the fur around his paws. He stood beside Nolan, but his gaze remained on Abner. Nolan wanted to say something useful. He had commanded men under fire, spoken into radios while the world broke apart, given orders when hesitation meant death. But no training had prepared him for an old man giving away his last companion because time had outflanked him. "I'll take care of him," Nolan said. Abner's mouth trembled. "See that you do?" The walk to the truck was quiet. Bracken moved at Nolan's left side, not healing exactly, not yet, but close enough to make old muscle memory stir. Nolan opened the passenger door. The dog sniffed the cab, the seat, the floor mats, the worn canvas jacket tossed near the console. He did not jump in immediately. Instead, Bracken turned back. Across the market, Abner still sat beneath the maple tree, one hand lifted in a farewell too small for the weight of what it carried. Snow began falling harder, soft white flakes drifting between them. For a strange moment, Nolan thought they looked like letters, thousands of them, sent by all the people and animals who had loved in silence because speaking would have made the leaving worse. Bracken climbed into the truck. Before Nolan closed the door, the old dog pressed his nose once against the cold window, eyes fixed on Abner. Nolan stood there with one hand on the doorframe, feeling the storm gather over the mountains and something else gather inside him. Not hope. Not yet. Hope was too bright a word for a man who had spent 3 months living like an extinguished lamp. But there was a weight at the end of the leash now, a responsibility, a heartbeat not his own. And sometimes, Nolan thought as he shut the door gently, maybe that was how the dead began leading the living back home. By the time Nolan turned onto Harrow Mill Road, the storm had begun testing the valley. Not raging yet, not shouting, just tapping its fingers on the windshield, sending small flakes across the glass like scouts ahead of an army. The road climbed out of Brightwater Gap in a slow bend, past stone walls half buried in snow, past mailboxes leaning like tired sentries, past the old mill creek frozen at the edges but still muttering under the ice. Bracken sat in the passenger seat without lying down. The old German shepherd had accepted the ride, but not comfort. His body stayed angled toward the window, one torn ear turned toward Nolan, the other toward the world outside. Every time a branch scraped the truck roof, his shoulders tightened. When the heater rattled, his nose shifted toward the dashboard. When Nolan reached for the gearshift, Bracken watched the hand, not the man. Nolan understood that kind of vigilance. It was not distrust exactly. Distrust was too simple. This was the discipline of a creature who had survived by believing the quiet could turn violent at any moment. "House isn't much," Nolan said, mostly to fill the cab with something gentler than the wind. "Roof leaks, stove complains, coffee's bad enough to violate local law." Bracken did not look impressed. "Fair?" The house appeared through the trees, dark timber against white ground, porch roof sagging under old snow. Maren used to say it looked like a stubborn animal that had decided not to die. A broad-shouldered thing with crooked windows, a stone chimney, and a front door painted blue, because she said every lost traveler deserved one cheerful lie before discovering how much work the place needed. Nolan parked beside the woodpile. For a moment, he did not move. Bringing Bracken inside felt different from bringing home supplies. A dog changed the air of a house. A dog heard things, needed things, remembered things. Nolan had spent 3 months keeping the room still, as if any movement might disturb the last shape Maren had left behind. Now beside him sat a living creature with a silver muzzle and battlefield eyes. "Okay," Nolan said quietly. "One rule. Don't judge the mess." Bracken looked at him. Nolan sighed. "You're going to judge the mess." The dog stepped down stiffly from the truck, favoring his left hip for the first few paces. Nolan noticed and filed it away. Inside the canvas folder Abner had given him were vet notes about joint pain, mild arthritis, anxiety around sharp metallic sounds, clinical words, small words trying to describe an old soldier's weather. He unlocked the front door. Cold air rushed out as if the house had been holding its breath. The entryway smelled of pine boards, dust, old smoke, and the faint lemon soap Maren used to buy from a woman at the winter market. Nolan had stopped using it after she died, but the scent remained in corners, stubborn as grace. Bracken entered slowly. He did not surge forward like a curious pet. He crossed the threshold and paused, head low, nose working. His paws were almost silent on the worn floorboards. He moved first to the kitchen, then the hallway, then back toward the main room where the stone fireplace stood cold and black. Nolan set the supplies near the door and watched. The house seemed to notice the dog before it noticed Nolan. Boards creaked under Bracken's weight. Wind pressed against the windows. Somewhere in the wall, an old pipe ticked. Bracken stopped in front of Maren's chair. The blue-gray scarf still lay over the back of it. Nolan's chest tightened so abruptly he had to turn away. He had meant to move it 12 times, fold it into a box, put it in the bedroom, give it the dignity of being preserved instead of the cruelty of being abandoned in plain sight. But every time he touched it, he heard her voice. Not every crooked thing is asking to be fixed. Bracken lifted his muzzle to the scarf. He did not sniff it like a dog discovering a strange household smell. He touched it with the careful slowness of recognition. His eyes softened. A sound came from his throat, low and almost hidden, not quite a whine, not quite a sigh. Then the old shepherd folded himself down beside the chair. Nolan stood very still. "No," he whispered, though he did not know what he was denying. Bracken rested his head on his paws. His torn ear flicked once. His eyes remained on the scarf. Nolan remembered Maren in that chair, knees tucked under her, a pencil in her hair, papers spread across her lap. He remembered her coming home smelling faintly of kennel disinfectant and cedar oil, hands nicked from working with nervous dogs. "Some of them don't know the war ended," she had told him once. He had been standing at the sink, washing mud from his hands after repairing a fence. "The dogs?" he had asked. Maren had looked at him for one beat too long. "Yes," she had said, "the dogs." Now Bracken lay beside her chair as if he had been here before, or had spent years trying to return to a place he knew only through scent and kindness. Nolan sat on the edge of the couch. For the first time in months, the house did not feel empty. That did not make it easier. It made the emptiness visible. He spent the afternoon doing what the storm required. He carried plywood to the north window, sealed the crack as best he could, stacked wood closer to the back door, checked the oil lamps, and cleared the porch roof with a long-handled rake. Bracken followed when he chose to, and stayed when he chose not to. He did not seek affection, but he kept Nolan in sight. Once Nolan dropped a hammer. The metal struck the floor with a hard crack. Bracken vanished behind the kitchen island so fast Nolan barely saw him move. Nolan froze, hand still open. "Sorry," he said. The word sounded foolish in the large room, too small for whatever memory had just torn through the dog. Bracken crouched behind the island, breathing hard, amber eyes fixed on the hammer as if it might grow teeth. Nolan did not go to him. He lowered himself slowly to sit on the floor near the fireplace, far enough away to leave space, close enough not to abandon him. "Bad sound," he said. "I know." The dog's breathing did not settle. Nolan looked at the hammer. "Had a mortar land close once," he said, his voice quiet. "For 2 weeks after, a dropped pan made me want to crawl out of my own skin. Marin tried to make soup. I nearly attacked a saucepan. Very heroic chapter in my life." Bracken's ears shifted. "Don't tell anyone." A long minute passed, then another. At last Bracken stepped out from behind the island, not fully calm but willing. He crossed the room and lay down several feet from Nolan, close enough that the distance felt chosen rather than forced. Nolan did not touch him. He simply sat there with the old dog and the fallen hammer between them, two veterans negotiating with a world too loud for peace. The next morning, Nolan drove Bracken to Dr. Amos Kittredge's clinic before the worst of the storm closed the upper roads. The clinic sat behind a feed store at the edge of town, a low building with green trim, a snow shovel by the door, and a hand-painted sign that read, "Kittredge Animal Care. Large, small, stubborn, and otherwise." Dr. Amos Kittredge opened the door before Nolan knocked. He was 61, broad through the hands and slightly bent in the shoulders from years of leaning over examination tables. His hair and short beard were the same winter white, but his pale eyes were sharp enough to make most lies sit down and behave. "Well," Amos said, looking at Bracken, "that's not a pet store shepherd." "No. Didn't think so." Amos lowered himself slightly and held out the back of his hand, not reaching, just offering information. "Morning, soldier." Bracken sniffed once. Amos waited until the dog looked away before moving. Nolan liked him for that. Inside, the clinic smelled of antiseptic, hay, dog biscuits, and coffee better than Nolan's by a margin that felt personally insulting. Amos examined Bracken with quiet competence. Hips, teeth, old scars beneath the fur, range of motion, heart, lungs, paws. He scanned the microchip, then frowned at the screen. "You brought paperwork?" Nolan handed him the canvas folder. Amos read in silence. His expression changed only once, when he reached a water-damaged page listing rehabilitation intake notes from years earlier. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured. "What?" Amos turned the folder so Nolan could see. There, in faded print, was the name of the volunteer assigned during Bracken's adjustment period, Nolan Rusk. For a few seconds, Nolan heard nothing but the hum of the fluorescent lights. The letters looked impossible. Ordinary ink, ordinary paper. A dead woman's name sitting inside a dog's history as calmly as if she had been waiting for him to find it. Amos watched him without pity, which Nolan appreciated more than kindness. "She worked with him?" Nolan asked. "Looks that way. Not full-time staff. Volunteer rehabilitation aide. 6-week period, maybe longer. Notes say Bracken had transition stress, sound sensitivity, refusal to bond after separation from handler." Amos looked down at the shepherd. "Your wife must have had patience." "She did." "More than I deserved," Nolan did not say. Bracken leaned against Nolan's leg then. Not dramatically, not like a scene arranged for comfort. Just the smallest transfer of weight. Fur against fabric, warmth against bone. Nolan's hand hovered for a moment before settling on the dog's neck. He could feel the old strength there. And something else. A bridge, Not a mystical thing, not destiny wearing a golden crown. Something simpler and harder to dismiss. Marin had touched this animal's life. Nolan had crossed paths with him in war. Abner had loved him through aging and loneliness. Now Bracken stood between all of them, carrying more memory than any creature should be asked to carry. Amos cleared his throat gently. He'll need joint support, soft food for a while, and quiet. No shouting, no sudden banging if you can help it. He's not fragile, but he's not a machine either. No, Nolan said. He isn't. I mean that for both of you. Nolan looked at him. Amos was already writing notes, as if he had not said anything at all. On the way out, Amos handed Nolan a bottle of pills, a feeding plan, and a look sharp enough to cut twine. Bring him back in a week, sooner if he limps worse or stops eating. And Nolan? Yeah? Don't make him into a memorial. The word struck too close. Amos glanced at Bracken. Dogs need a living home, not a shrine. Nolan nodded once. He did not trust himself to answer. After the clinic, he stopped at Whitaker Hardware for the rest of the supplies. He planned to leave Bracken in the truck only long enough to buy lamp wicks and a better tarp, but Bracken stood in the cab and stared through the windshield as if he had already decided Nolan's plans were suggestions. So Nolan brought him inside. June Whitaker looked up from behind the counter and stopped mid-sentence to a customer buying furnace tape. Well, she said, that explains why the air got more interesting. June was 58, solid as a stove, with salt and pepper hair cut to her chin and cheeks reddened from hauling lumber in cold weather. She wore a red flannel shirt under a quilted brown vest, a tape measure clipped at her hip like a sheriff's badge. Her gaze moved from Nolan to Bracken, then softened in a way she would have denied under oath. Marin would have loved him, she said. Nolan's hand tightened on the leash. She did, he said. June's expression changed. He told her only the plain facts. Retired K-9. Abner, the file, Marin's name in the rehabilitation notes. June did not cry. June Whitaker handled emotion the way she handled warped boards, with pressure, patience, and the occasional insult. That woman, she said, voice rough, always leaving pieces of herself in places a person could trip over later, Nolan managed. Sounds like her. It was her. June reached under the counter and pulled out a small bag of dog treats. And you look like you've been sitting in that house guarding grief like it's a national monument. I've been busy. Doing what? Aging the dust? Bracken took the treat from her hand with grave politeness. June pointed at him. See? This one has manners. You might learn something. Nolan almost smiled. Again, it was becoming a disturbing pattern. Then June lowered her voice. Since you're here, you should know Cross has been sniffing around the east side again. Leland Cross? Who else wears cashmere to a mud season zoning meeting? June leaned closer. He's buying homes before the storm drops values further, offering quick money. Too quick. Folks are scared. Heat bills, repairs, taxes. He makes it sound like mercy. Nolan looked toward the window. Across the square, snow thickened. Not my business, he said. June stared at him so long he wished she would yell instead. Marin thought it was, she said. That ended the conversation more effectively than shouting. Nolan paid for the supplies and left with Bracken at his side. Back home, the storm closed over the hill. By evening, wind dragged its claws along the siding. Snow crowded the windows. Nolan fed Bracken soft food, mixed with the first dose of joint medication hidden in sausage. Bracken ate the sausage, discovered the pill, gave Nolan a look of solemn betrayal, then swallowed it anyway. Abner warned me, Nolan said. The dog huffed. Nolan built a fire. He made coffee he did not drink. He sat in the main room while Bracken lay near Marin's chair, not on the scarf but close enough for the scent. June's words lingered. Marin thought it was. Nolan did not want a cause. Causes were hungry. They asked men to stand up before they were ready. They took grief and sharpened it into duty. He wanted a roof that held, a window that did not leak, a storm that passed without requiring anything from him except wood and patience. The wind struck the house hard enough to make the walls shudder. Bracken lifted his head. At first Nolan thought it was the storm. Then the dog rose, slowly but with purpose, and crossed to the wall behind the fireplace. Not the chair, not the scarf. The wall. He placed one front paw against a lower wood panel. Then he looked back at Nolan. "No," Nolan said softly. "We're not doing mysteries tonight." Bracken did not move. Nolan stared at the panel. It was old pine, darkened by smoke and years. He had meant to replace it. Marin had told him not to. "Original wood has memory," she'd said. "Don't bully it just because it isn't pretty." Nolan set his mug down. The panel had a slight seam he had never noticed, or had refused to notice. He took a flathead screwdriver from the toolbox and worked it carefully along the edge. The wood gave with a dry sigh. Behind it was a narrow, hollow space. Inside lay a metal tube, dull silver, wrapped at both ends with black tape to keep out moisture. Nolan stood unmoving for a long moment. Bracken lowered his paw. The fire popped softly. Outside, the storm pressed its white hands against the glass. Nolan opened the tube. There was no money, no weapon, no grand confession waiting to shout from the dark. Only folded papers, hand-drawn maps of Brightwater Gap, old photographs of the mill road and church steps, notes in Marin's slanted handwriting, a few copied records, and on top, an envelope with his name. "Nolan, if you found this, it means someone finally pulled you back into the house." He read the line once, then again. The room blurred before he could stop it. Bracken came to him and stood close, not leaning this time, not asking, simply present. An old dog with a torn ear, silver muzzle, and Marin's scent still alive somewhere in his memory. Nolan sat on the floor with the papers in his lap. For 3 months he had believed the house was grieving because Marin was gone. Now he wondered if it had been waiting. Nolan did not sleep after finding the metal tube. The storm worked over the house all night, pushing snow against the windows and dragging wind through the trees like a saw through old bone. The fire burned low, then flared whenever a pocket of sap caught in the wood. Bracken lay near Marin's chair, his silver muzzle resting on his paws, one torn ear turned toward Nolan even in sleep. Nolan sat on the floor with Marin's papers spread around him. He had faced maps before. Bad maps. Satellite prints blurred by weather. Hand-drawn routes passed from one unit to another with too much confidence and not enough truth. He had learned to distrust clean lines. The earth always had a way of ignoring what men drew on paper. But Marin's maps were different. They were not military. They were tender. She had drawn Brightwater Gap in pencil and ink, the old mill road, the creek, the white church on St. Anselm Ridge, the row of worker houses near the lower bridge, the schoolhouse that was now a quilt shop, the abandoned sawmill with its long roof collapsed at one end. In the corners she had sketched small symbols, a pine tree, a gear, a bell, a square with 3 lines through it. Nolan touched one mark with his thumb. He could see her doing this at the table, hair tied back, pencil tucked behind one ear, one sock slipping down because she never bought socks that behaved. He could almost hear her muttering at some old record, scolding the past for having terrible handwriting. At the top of one page, Marin had written, "Brightwater Gap Community Land Trust, not folklore. Find legal chain. Do not assume." Nolan read the words twice, not folklore. A few pages later came the letter, not the short note from the envelope, a longer one. Folded into thirds, creased hard as if she had carried it around before deciding to hide it. "Nolan, if you are reading this, I am either braver than I thought, or something went wrong before I could make the case properly." He stopped there. The wind struck the house. Bracken lifted his head but did not rise. Nolan forced himself to continue. Marin wrote about Brightwater Gap before ski brochures and rental cabins, before Leland Cross returned with investors and polished boots. She wrote about the sawmill after the Second World War, when men came home carrying nightmares in their pockets, and women kept households standing with rationed sugar, hard hands, and a refusal to call endurance noble when it was mostly exhausting. Several families, she wrote, had pooled land around the mill. Not charity. Protection. A community trust meant to keep workers, widows, disabled veterans, and longtime residents from being priced out if the valley ever became profitable to outsiders. The records had scattered after floods, county reorganizations, fires, deaths, and simple neglect. People stopped saying land trust and started saying old arrangement, then local rumor, then nothing at all. But Marin had found traces. A copied tax note from 1951, a meeting reference in a church ledger, a boundary description in a damaged deed, the pine and gear mark on maps and tools from the old mill. And then there was Leland. Nolan sat back against the couch, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. Marin believed Leland Cross knew enough to be dangerous. He had been buying homes and lots before winter, moving quickly, offering cash to people already frightened by heating bills, medical debt, roof damage, and tax notices. He did not need to break doors. He only needed to knock when people were tired. If he gathered enough properties before the trust could be proven, Brightwater Gap might be transformed legally before anyone understood what they had lost. Marin's next line made Nolan go still. "I did not tell you everything, because I was afraid you would try to fight a paper war like it was a firefight. That is not an insult, my love. It is an observation earned over 13 years of watching you attack broken appliances as if they had sworn allegiance to enemy forces." A laugh came out of him before he expected it. Small, pained, real. Bracken opened one eye. Nolan wiped at his face, annoyed with himself and grateful to her all at once. Then the next lines ended the laugh. "You are brave, Nolan, but grief makes bravery reckless. I needed proof before I brought you in. I needed the kind of proof that would force you to slow down, ask for help, and let someone else stand beside you." He lowered the letter. For 3 months he had turned Marin's silence into another wound. He had imagined all the things she had not told him, all the rooms inside her life he had failed to enter before the door closed forever. Now he saw the shape of it differently. She had not hidden this because she did not trust him. She had hidden it because she knew him too well, because she had seen the man who woke from nightmares with his fists closed, the man who became calm in danger and dangerous in helplessness, the man who could repair a roof, clear a room, carry a stranger out of burning wreckage, and still stand useless before a sheet of county paperwork. Bracken rose and came to him. The old shepherd did not put his head in Nolan's lap. He simply stood close, shoulder against Nolan's arm, warm and steady. Nolan touched the dog's neck. "She was right," he said. Bracken huffed softly, as if that had been obvious from the beginning. By morning, the storm had thinned to a hard silver snow. Roads were not good, but they were passable if a man drove like he valued both life and axle alignment. Nolan packed Marin's papers into a waterproof case, placed the scarf in the top compartment without thinking, then noticed what he had done. He almost took it out. Instead, he closed the case. Bracken watched from the doorway. "No chewing legal documents," Nolan said. The dog looked offended. "Fine, no judging legal documents." That seemed acceptable. Evelyn Hartwell lived at the far end of Birch Street in a white house, so carefully maintained it seemed to disapprove of weather. Snow lay in exact ridges along the walkway. The porch rail had been brushed clean. A brass door knocker shaped like an owl stared at Nolan as if preparing to bill him for the visit. He had met Evelyn only a few times before Maren died. She had been Maren's friend once, though not the easy kind. Their friendship had the feel of two sharp instruments kept in the same drawer, useful, respected, occasionally dangerous to reach for. Evelyn opened the door before he knocked twice. She was 67, slender and straight-backed, with white hair cut in a precise bob, and gray eyes behind thin-framed glasses. She wore a charcoal turtleneck and a dark wool blazer, as if retirement were an argument she had not fully accepted. Her gaze moved from Nolan's face to the case in his hand, then to Bracken at his side. "I wondered when you would come," she said. Nolan frowned. "You knew?" "I knew Maren was working on something. I also knew she was stubborn enough to hide it badly and clever enough to hide it well." Evelyn stepped back. "Wipe your boots. The dog may enter if he behaves better than most people." Bracken crossed the threshold with grave dignity. Evelyn's house smelled of old books, black tea, lemon polish, and a faint trace of wood smoke. There were no family photographs on the walls, only framed maps, old legal prints, and one watercolor of Brightwater Gap before the mill closed. She led Nolan into a dining room that had clearly become a war room for a woman who believed battles should be fought with indexed folders. A long table stood beneath a brass lamp. Legal pads were stacked with military precision. A silver fountain pen rested on a blotter. Nolan placed Maren's documents on the table. Evelyn did not reach for them immediately. "She came to me 2 weeks before the accident," she said. Nolan felt his jaw tighten. "You didn't tell me. You were burying your wife. That wasn't your decision to make." "No," Evelyn said. "It was mine to regret." There was no softness in her voice, but something behind it had cracked long ago and never reset properly. She sat and began reviewing the pages. Nolan stood. Bracken lay near the doorway, but kept his eyes on him. For nearly 20 minutes, the only sounds were paper shifting, wind tapping the glass, and Evelyn making small disapproving noises under her breath. At last she removed her glasses. "Well?" Nolan asked. Evelyn looked at him the way a surgeon might look at a patient asking whether a kitchen knife and enthusiasm were enough to perform an operation. "This is not nothing," she said. Nolan exhaled. "But it is not enough." His shoulders stiffened. Evelyn tapped Maren's map with the end of her pen. "Your wife was brilliant to find these references. But references are not enforceable rights. Copies are not originals. Memories are not title chains. If Cross has signed purchase agreements, we cannot wave a pine tree symbol at him and expect him to retreat in terror." "She found proof." "She found smoke," Evelyn said. "We still need the fire." Nolan leaned over the table. "Then tell me what we need." "Original trust charter, if it exists. Boundary map. Tax records tying the land to the trust or its trustees. Minutes showing voting rules. Evidence that the trust was never legally dissolved. And someone who can authenticate the old mill symbols beyond local mythology." The words came fast, precise, merciless. Nolan hated how reasonable they were. "Maren believed Cross knew," he said. "I am inclined to agree." "Then why didn't you help her?" Evelyn's face changed, not much, but enough. "Because the last time I helped people fight a development deal, I lost, badly. They lost homes they might have kept longer if I had been wiser. I mistook righteousness for strategy." Her fingers rested on the pen. "Maren thought I had become a coward." "Had you?" The room cooled. Bracken rose. Evelyn looked at Nolan over her glasses. "Careful, Mr. Rusk. Pain does not make you perceptive. It only makes you loud." Nolan's anger flashed white, not because she was wrong, because she was close. He took one step forward. Bracken moved instantly, catching the camouflage sleeve of Nolan's combat shirt between his teeth. Not hard, not playful. A precise hold. Nolan froze. The old dog did not growl. He simply held the fabric and looked up at him. The message was embarrassingly clear. Do not become the thing she feared. Nolan released a slow breath. Evelyn watched the dog for a long moment. Her sharp expression softened, not into sentiment, but into recognition. "That scarf in your case," she said. "Blue-gray wool?" Nolan glanced down. "Marin made it during the winter she volunteered at the K-9 Rehabilitation Center," Evelyn said. "She brought it here once, said one particular shepherd kept stealing it from the back of a chair and sleeping on it as if it were government property." Bracken let go of Nolan's sleeve. Nolan looked at him. The dog sat, solemn and unrepentant. Evelyn's mouth moved almost toward a smile. "I suppose that answers one question." "Which question?" "Whether Marin left you only papers?" She looked back at the table. "Apparently she left you supervision." Against his will, Nolan felt the edge of anger dull. Evelyn gathered the documents into careful stacks. "I will review these. I am not promising victory. I am not promising court filings. I am not promising that Cross will not bury us in motions until spring." "What are you promising?" "That I will tell you the truth, and that if there is a legal path, I will find where it begins." Nolan nodded. For him, patience had always felt like doing nothing while danger gathered. In the teams, hesitation could cost lives. But this was not a raid. No breach charge, no clear target, no night vision world of green shapes and clean commands. This was a war of old paper, frightened neighbors, county records, and a dead woman's unfinished faith. It made him feel helpless, which was probably why Marin had known he needed help. Evelyn turned one of Marin's notebooks around. She made a list of people to speak with. Nolan leaned closer. 3 names had been circled: Harlan Vossler, Tessa Vale, Abner Pike. "Harlan worked at the mill as a boy," Evelyn said. "If anyone remembers the trust marks, he might." "Tessa keeps the town archives, unofficially and with alarming possessiveness. Abner Pike was once an assistant at St. Anselm's, back when the church still kept community records in its bell tower." Nolan looked at Abner's name. Something uneasy moved through him. "I'll start with Abner." "You may have difficulty." "Why?" Evelyn's eyes sharpened. June Whitaker answered that question an hour later. Nolan found her at the hardware store arguing with a delivery driver about whether before lunch could still mean mid-afternoon if a man wore a guilty face. She stopped when she saw him. "You look like someone handed you homework," she said. "Evelyn?" Legal homework. Worse than regular. Regular homework doesn't charge by the hour." "I need to find Abner Pike." June's expression lost its humor. "What?" "He was on Marin's list. He worked at St. Anselm's. I need to talk to him." June set down the receipt in her hand. "Nolan," she said, "Abner's gone." He felt Bracken shift beside him. "What do you mean, gone?" "Transferred this morning. Assisted care facility up near Montpelier. Earlier than planned." "He told me next week." "That was the plan." June lowered her voice. "Then some anonymous donor paid the intake fees and transportation. Paperwork got pushed through fast." Nolan stared at her. Outside, a plow passed the store window, throwing a gray wave of slush onto the curb. "Anonymous donor," he said. June's mouth tightened. "That's what they're calling it." Bracken stepped closer to Nolan's leg. Nolan could feel the old reaction rising. Identify threat, move now, force answer, break obstacle. It came easily, cleanly, like an old blade sliding from a sheath. Then he saw Bracken's amber eyes. He saw Marin's handwriting. He heard Evelyn. "Pain does not make you perceptive. It only makes you loud." Nolan closed his hand around the strap of the document case until the leather creaked. Do you know which facility? June studied him, perhaps measuring whether she was about to hand a match to a man standing in dry grass. I can find out, she said, but you don't go storming in like you're kicking doors overseas. I won't. Say it again with your face believing you. Nolan looked down at Bracken. The old dog sat at his side, silent as a monk guarding a dangerous prayer. I won't, Nolan said, slower this time. June nodded. Good. Because if Marin left you a trail, it wasn't so you could trample it. That evening, Nolan returned to the house with more questions than answers. The storm had eased, but the world outside remained buried, every fence post and stump softened into white shapes. The house waited at the top of the hill, its blue door half covered in wind-blown snow. Inside, he placed Marin's papers back on the table, not hidden now. The room changed because of it. The documents did not shout. They did not accuse. They simply existed, fragile and stubborn, asking to be followed. Bracken went to Marin's chair and lay beside it. Nolan stood by the fireplace, looking at the old maps of Brightwater Gap. For 3 months he had thought his duty was to survive the winter without Marin. Now he understood she had been fighting for something while he had been only trying not to drown. A poor town's right to remain itself. A dead mill's memory. A line of homes Leland Cross wanted to polish into profitable silence. Nolan touched the pine and gear symbol drawn in Marin's hand. He was not ready for this. That no longer mattered. Outside, snow slid from the roof in a heavy hush, like the mountain itself turning a page. The storm came before Brightwater Gap was ready. It crossed the mountains after midnight, not like weather, but like an old army returning to claim a debt. By dawn, the valley had vanished beneath a white assault. Snow erased fence lines, softened roofs, swallowed the lower steps of porches, and turned parked trucks into sleeping beasts beneath thick blankets of ice. The power went out first on the east side, then along Mill Road, then in the square where the traffic light swung uselessly above an empty intersection, glowing no color at all. Nolan woke to the deep hush that followed heavy snow. Not silence. Silence was clean. This was something heavier, a muffled world pressing its palm over the town's mouth. Bracken was already awake. The old German shepherd stood near the front window, head lowered, torn ear angled toward the storm. In the bluish morning light, his black and gold coat looked almost ancient, like the pelt of some winter guardian from a story people once told around stoves. His body was tense but not frightened. Weather, at least, was honest. It did not smile while reaching for your deed. Nolan fed the stove, checked the patched window, and made coffee so bitter it could have been used to strip paint from a barn door. By 8, June Whitaker called. "You alive up there?" she asked. "Depends who's asking." "The woman who sold you rope yesterday and has legal authority to mock your knots." Nolan glanced toward Bracken. "We're fine." "We?" He heard the smile in her voice. "The dog and me." "Good. Bring both of yourselves down when the road clears enough. Tessa says she found something in the old meeting books." "Tessa Vale?" "You know many clock repair women who hoard town records like dragon treasure?" Nolan looked at the snow piling against the porch rail. "Road's bad." "Everything's bad. That's the town motto now." She hung up before he could answer. By late morning, the county plow had made one narrow pass along Harrow Mill Road. Nolan loaded Marin's documents into a waterproof case and wrapped them in a spare coat, not because the case needed warmth, but because his hands wanted something protective to do. Bracken climbed into the truck more easily this time, though he still watched every movement with that careful soldier's patience. The drive down was slow. Twice Nolan had to stop and clear branches from the road. At the lower bend, he passed the first of Leland Cross's signs staked into a snowbank near a boarded cottage. Future site of Brightwater Ridge. A new season for an old town. The letters were elegant, dark green against cream, as if greed had hired a tasteful designer. Bracken growled softly. "Yeah?" Nolan said. "Subtle, isn't it?" Tessa Vale's clock shop sat wedged between a closed barber shop and a bakery that now opened only 3 days a week. The sign above the door read, "Vale Time and Repair," though half the gold paint had flaked off the word time, leaving it looking wounded. Inside, the shop ticked. Every wall held clocks, mantel clocks, schoolhouse clocks, brass carriage clocks, one enormous grandfather clock with a moon dial that looked permanently unimpressed. The air smelled of machine oil, dust, old paper, and peppermint tea. Tessa Vale stood at the back counter beneath a lamp, sleeves rolled to her elbows, a magnifying loupe hanging from a leather cord around her neck. She was 46, small and sharp, with cropped black hair threaded with silver and fingers stained faintly from oil. She did not look up when Nolan entered. "If you drip snow on my floor, Rusk, I'll invoice you for emotional damages." "I'll stand very still." That has never solved anything in this town. Then she saw Bracken. Her expression changed, not soft exactly, but attentive. Tessa had the look of someone who trusted mechanisms more than moods, yet she gave the old dog a respectful nod. "You must be the retired soldier everyone's whispering about." Bracken sniffed the air and sneezed. "Good," Tessa said. "We agree about dust." June was already there, red flannel sleeves rolled up, coffee thermos on the counter like field artillery. Evelyn Hartwell sat at a narrow table with her coat still on, gloved hands folded over a stack of papers. Even surrounded by crooked clocks, she looked perfectly aligned. Tessa opened a ledger the size of a church Bible. "Town meeting minutes," she said. "Unofficial copy. Official ones got water damaged in the courthouse basement sometime around 1978 because apparently paper and Vermont basements entered a suicide pact decades ago." Nolan leaned in. On the yellowed page, beneath careful cursive, was the mark again. A pine tree, a gear, a bell, Marin's symbols. Evelyn adjusted her glasses. "Read the entry." Tessa tapped the page. March 12, 1952. Motion carried to preserve common mill parcels under trustee supervision until such time as resident families may vote on transfer or dissolution. Trustees to store charter copy and boundary map with St. Anselm Parish records until county filing is confirmed. June let out a low whistle. "That sounds less like folklore." "It sounds like smoke," Evelyn said. "Possibly fire. We still need originals." Tessa flipped another page. "There's more, references to Harlan Vossler's father. And Abner Pike's name appears later as a parish assistant in the 70s. He signed off on an inventory after the flood." Nolan felt the line tighten. "Can you reach Abner?" June had already pulled out her phone. "I got the facility number." The call took 3 transfers, one hold long enough for Tessa to mutter that civilization had peaked with rotary phones, and finally a nurse willing to pass the phone to Abner. His voice came thin through the speaker. "Nolan?" "I'm here," Nolan said. "Bracken's with me." There was a pause. "He eating?" "Like he suspects every pill is a government plot." Abner gave a weak chuckle. "Smart dog." Evelyn leaned toward the phone. "Mr. Pike, this is Evelyn Hartwell. We need to ask about St. Anselm Parish records, specifically after the mill flood." "Lord," Abner whispered. Marin was right then. The room went still. "You spoke with Marin?" Nolan asked. "She came by twice. Sweet woman, eyes like she could see through cheap excuses." Abner coughed. "Asked about the old trust papers. I told her what Father Callahan told me years ago." "What did he tell you?" "That after the flood, some records were sealed in wax and put where damp couldn't get them. He called it—" Abner's voice faded, then returned. "The beeswax tube in the belly of the bell." Tessa looked up from the ledger. "The bell tower," she said. "At St. Anselm," Evelyn murmured. Nolan closed his eyes for 1 second. Not victory. A direction, that was all. Sometimes a direction was enough to keep a man from freezing where he stood. But outside the clock shop window, 2 men in heavy jackets stood beneath the awning across the street, reading one of Leland's flyers. A woman Nolan recognized from the east side had her arms crossed tight against her chest. She saw him looking and turned away. Brightwater Gap had begun to divide, not down the center, but into small private fractures. By afternoon, the town square had become an argument-wearing snow boots. Some people came into Whitaker Hardware asking about Marin's papers in lowered voices. Others came in angry because rumors had already run faster than the plows. A few wanted to know whether Nolan was trying to block development entirely. A few asked if lawsuits would make their taxes rise. One man said he had already signed with Cross and did not appreciate being made to feel like a traitor for needing money. Nolan listened until he could not. He stepped outside with Bracken to clear his head. That was when Leland Cross arrived. He did not come in a dramatic black car. He came in a dark blue SUV with winter tires, clean windows, and headlights bright enough to make the snow in front of him glitter like broken glass. He stepped out wearing a camel wool coat over a black turtleneck, leather gloves, and boots that looked expensive, but had never split wood. He was 49, lean and composed, with swept-back brown hair touched by silver and a smile that arrived a fraction before warmth did. "Nolan Rusk," Leland said, as if greeting an old acquaintance instead of a man he had never bothered to know. "I'm sorry we haven't spoken properly since Marin's service." Nolan said nothing. Bracken stood at his left side, body still. Leland glanced at the dog, measured him, then looked back at Nolan. "Beautiful animal. He's not decoration." "No, I can see that." Leland's smile thinned. "Word is you found some old paperwork." Word travels fast when someone's afraid of paper. A few people nearby pretended not to listen. June watched from the hardware store window, one hand on the doorframe. Evelyn stood behind her, expression unreadable. Leland stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to make the conversation feel private, while ensuring the right witnesses could still catch pieces of it. "This town has been dying for 30 years, he said. Marin understood that. Nolan's hand tightened on Bracken's leash. "Don't use her name. I respected your wife. Truly, she cared about Brightwater Gap, but caring is not a plan." Leland looked around the square, the closed barber shop, the cracked sidewalk, the empty storefront where a pharmacy used to be. "I grew up here. I know what this place is. Cold rooms, empty promises, people pretending poverty has character because admitting otherwise would hurt too much." Nolan looked at him then. For the first time, he heard something under the polish, not guilt, anger, old anger, preserved like meat in winter. "You want to help?" Nolan said. "I want to make the town viable. By buying it before people understand what they're signing. By offering them a way out before another winter breaks them." Leland's eyes sharpened. "Not everyone can afford sentiment, Mr. Rusk." The sentence struck several people on the sidewalk. Nolan saw it land, saw a woman look down, saw a man who had signed with Cross stare at his boots. That was the danger. Leland did not lie all the time. He chose truths that pointed where he wanted them to. Then he said almost gently, "Marin was a good woman, but she loved lost causes. This town, old dogs, men who came home with more ghosts than plans." Nolan moved before thought could civilize him. One step. Enough. Bracken shifted in front of him. Not attacking, not snarling. The old dog simply placed his body between Nolan and Leland, then looked back at Nolan's clenched fist. The square seemed to hold its breath. Nolan could feel the old heat in his blood. The clean, terrible desire to solve a problem with force, because force at least had honesty. He could see Leland watching, almost inviting it. One shove, one punch, one public loss of control. and Nolan would become exactly the unstable widower Leland needed him to be. Bracken's amber eyes did not plead. They ordered, "Stand down." Nolan opened his hand. The cold rushed into his palm. Leland's smile faded just enough to reveal disappointment. June stepped out of the hardware store. "Well, this is touching. 2 grown men measuring antlers in a snowstorm. Very efficient use of daylight." A few people laughed nervously. The spell broke. Leland looked at June, then Evelyn, then the people watching from storefronts and truck windows. He put his gloves back on, finger by finger. "I hope you all know what uncertainty costs," he said. "Banks don't wait for legends to be authenticated." He returned to his SUV and drove away, leaving tire tracks dark in the snow. That night, Nolan made copies of Marin's documents at June's store until the old machine overheated twice and Tessa accused it of lacking moral stamina. He brought the copies home in a cardboard file box and stored the originals in a metal case. The storm had picked up again. By 9, the wind sounded like something large circling the house. Bracken became restless. He paced from the front door to the back, nose lifted, ears working. Nolan checked the windows, then the stove, then the porch. Nothing. Snow blew hard across the yard. The wood shed hunched 20 yards from the house, a dark shape half buried near the tree line. Then Bracken barked. One sharp sound. Nolan turned. Orange light flickered behind the shed wall. For 1 second, his mind refused to name it. Then the fire climbed. Nolan grabbed the file box, shoved it under one arm, and ran into the storm. Cold hit his face like thrown gravel. Bracken surged beside him, barking now, not panicked, but urgent. The shed door was already smoking around the frame. Nolan could smell accelerant beneath the burning pine, sharp and wrong. He kicked the door open. Heat rolled out. The shed held tools, spare boards, old paint cans, winter tarps, and a crate where he had stupidly placed more copies before dinner. He plunged inside, pulling the crate toward the door. Smoke clawed down his throat. The fire ran along one wall with unnatural eagerness. Behind him, Bracken barked again. Nolan ignored it. He grabbed another stack of papers from the crate, coughing hard, eyes burning. A beam overhead snapped. Bracken came in. The dog seized Nolan's sleeve and pulled. "Out!" Nolan rasped. Bracken pulled harder, planting his paws. The absurdity of it almost made Nolan angry. An old dog with a bad hip trying to drag a former SEAL out of a burning shed because the former SEAL was too stubborn to stop rescuing paper. Marin would have had things to say. The beam cracked again. Nolan let Bracken pull him. They stumbled into the snow just as part of the inner shelf collapsed, sending sparks into the black sky. Nolan fell to his knees, coughing so hard his ribs hurt. The rescued papers clutched against his chest. Bracken stood over him, smoke in his fur, eyes bright and furious. "Yeah," Nolan wheezed. "I know." By the time Sheriff Rowan Teague arrived, June and 2 neighbors had already come up the hill with extinguishers, buckets, and the kind of grim efficiency small towns discovered when flames threatened wood. Rowan stepped from his cruiser wearing a brown winter sheriff's coat, hat pulled low, mustache rimed with snow. He was a big man, gone thick around the middle, with tired eyes that looked as if they had read too many reports that ended badly. He took in the shed, the burn pattern, the blackened snow near the back wall. "This wasn't lightning," Nolan said. "No lightning tonight." "Wasn't the stove?" "No." Rowan crouched near the melted patch of snow, then stood slowly. He looked toward the woods, then at Nolan, then at the scorched documents in his arms. "I'll open an investigation." June made a sound that could have curdled milk. Rowan looked at her. "June? Don't June me. That shed didn't set itself on fire because it was feeling dramatic." "I said I'll investigate." "And while you investigate politely, Cross keeps collecting signatures." Rowan's jaw tightened. Evelyn arrived last, wrapped in a dark coat, her white hair tucked beneath a wool hat. She examined the damage without theatrical shock. "Sheriff," she said, "given the timing and the ongoing pressure on property owners, I recommend you issue a public advisory suspending any questionable transfers until records can be reviewed." Rowan looked tired suddenly. Older than 55. "You know what Cross's lawyers will do with that." "Yes," Evelyn said. "Their jobs." "And the town?" "Perhaps you should do yours." The words fell hard. For a moment, no one spoke. Rowan looked toward the burning shed. Nolan saw something pass through the sheriff's face. Not cowardice exactly, but an old wound being pressed. Later, June would tell him about the foreclosure years ago. Rowan stepping in too late, then too hard, making a legal mess that cost an old man his house faster. Since then, he had treated authority like a loaded weapon he was afraid to touch. But fear did not make the weapon disappear. Rowan removed his notebook. "I can't accuse Cross without evidence," he said. "No one asked you to lie," Nolan replied, voice raw from smoke. "Just stop pretending nothing's happening." Rowan looked at him for a long second. Then he began writing. "I'll advise residents to delay signing new agreements until the land records are reviewed. I'll request county assistance on the fire, and I'll document potential coercion claims if anyone comes forward." June folded her arms. That almost sounded like a spine growing. Rowan gave her a weary look. "You ever consider being less encouraging?" "No." Bracken sneezed smoke. That was the first time Nolan laughed that night. Not because anything was funny, because the alternative was letting the fire win more than wood. Later, after the neighbors left and Rowan's cruiser disappeared down the hill, Nolan sat in the main room with the surviving papers spread near the hearth to dry. The house smelled of smoke now, bitter and invasive. His hands were blistered in 2 places. His lungs burned. Bracken lay beside him, fur singed lightly along one shoulder, but otherwise unharmed. Nolan had checked 3 times. Bracken had tolerated the attention with the stiff patience of a warrior being fussed over by an incompetent priest. Nolan opened Marin's letter again. The last line waited for him. "Do not turn grief into a fortress, Nolan. Turn it into a doorway." He had read it before, as a command. Tonight, in a room darkened by smoke and lit by fire, he read it as permission. A fortress kept pain out. It also kept everyone else out with it. A doorway meant risk, weather, strangers, trouble, dogs with torn ears, old women with legal pens, hardware store prophets carrying terrible coffee, sheriffs afraid of their own authority, a town too tired to believe, but not yet dead. Nolan looked at Bracken. The old shepherd's eyes were half closed, but his tail moved once against the floor. Outside, the storm still dragged its white cloak over the hills. Inside, Nolan gathered the scorched papers, not like a man clutching evidence, but like someone holding kindling. Not for burning, for light. Morning came after the storm like a tired blessing. The sky over Brightwater Gap had cleared to a pale winter blue, and sunlight lay across the snow in thin gold sheets. Every roof glittered, every pine bough sagged beneath white weight. The town looked almost innocent, as if the night had not brought fire, smoke, and the knowledge that someone was willing to burn paper rather than let old truth breathe. Nolan stood outside the charred remains of his woodshed, with Bracken beside him. The shed still smelled of wet ash. Black ribs of timber leaned against one another, steaming faintly in the cold. Yesterday it had held wood, tools, spare tarps, and copies of Marin's notes. Now it looked like a little ruined church for things that had almost been lost. Bracken sniffed the edge of the snow, then sneezed once, offended by the smoke. "Agreed," Nolan said. "Poor construction. Worse manners." The dog looked up at him, amber eyes steady. Nolan had slept 2 hours, maybe less. His throat still burned from smoke, and 2 fingers on his right hand were bandaged from grabbing hot metal He should have left alone. The old version of him would have taken the fire as permission to go hunting for whoever had done it. But Marin's words had followed him into the morning. Turn it into a doorway. So he did not go hunting. He loaded the surviving documents into his truck, tucked the original metal tube beneath the passenger seat, and drove down toward the square. They gathered outside Whitaker Hardware just after 8. June arrived first, carrying a thermos large enough to hydrate a logging crew. Evelyn came next in a dark wool coat, white hair tucked beneath a gray hat, her fountain pen already clipped to a leather folder. Tessa Vale appeared with a canvas satchel full of notebooks, measuring tape, a flashlight, 2 screwdrivers, a magnifying loupe, and what she called a reasonable distrust of old architecture. Sheriff Rowan Teague pulled up last in his cruiser, moving slower than usual, as if every step had been weighed overnight. He wore his brown winter coat and carried evidence bags, a camera, and the expression of a man who had decided to do something proper and was already regretting how complicated proper could become. Harlan Vossler waited on the bench outside the closed bakery. At 81, Harlan looked like the kind of man Winter had tried to collect several times and failed out of professional embarrassment. He was thin as a broom handle under a heavy plaid coat, with a narrow face, watery eyes, and hands swollen at the knuckles. A knitted cap sat crooked over wisps of white hair. Beside him rested a cane carved from dark wood, its handle polished by decades of use. June handed him coffee. "You put sugar in this?" Harlan asked. "Enough to keep you alive, but not enough to make you pleasant." "Cruel woman." "Accurate woman." Harlan smiled, then saw Nolan watching and nodded toward the ridge road. "If my memory's playing tricks, I apologize in advance." Tessa adjusted her satchel. "Memory always plays tricks. That's why we bring paper, witnesses, and people too stubborn to quit." Nolan looked toward St. Anselm Ridge. The old stone church stood above town, half hidden by pines. From below, its bell tower rose like a dark finger against the morning sky. Marin had loved that church, though she rarely attended services. She said it had the dignity of something built by hands that expected nothing to be easy. The road up was narrow and slick. Rowan insisted on taking 2 vehicles in case one slid off or stalled. Nolan drove the truck with Bracken in front and Harlan in back. June rode with Evelyn and Tessa in Rowan's cruiser, which June described over the radio as the least festive sleigh in Vermont. No one laughed much. The ridge road climbed through spruce and bare maple, past stone walls buried to their shoulders in snow. Twice they had to stop while Rowan cleared fallen branches. Once the cruiser slid sideways, and June's voice crackled over the radio. "If I die in a county vehicle, I want the minutes to reflect my disapproval." Tessa replied, "Noted for the archive." Nolan felt something loosen in his chest. Not joy, not ease, but the small warmth of people refusing to let fear have the only voice. St. Anselm's appeared beyond the trees. The church was built of gray stone darkened by weather, with narrow windows and a wooden door rimmed in ice. The bell tower leaned slightly east, as if listening to the valley below. Snow covered the steps. A rusted iron cross stood above the entrance, black against the brilliant sky. Harlan stood at the foot of the stairs, breathing hard. "My father helped repair this place after the flood," he said. "I was 13, maybe 14. Thought carrying boards made me a man." He looked at the tower. Father Callahan said the bell remembered every name the town tried to forget. Tessa glanced at him. "That is either beautiful or deeply inconvenient." "Both," Harlan said. Inside, the church smelled of cold stone, old wax, and wood long abandoned to silence. Their footsteps echoed over the floor. The pews had been covered with sheets, ghostly rows beneath dust. A small stained glass window near the altar caught the morning light and scattered it in faded blue and red across the snow tracked in by their boots. Bracken entered with caution, not fear, reverence almost. He moved slowly down the center aisle, nose lowered, ears shifting at the unfamiliar echoes. Nolan kept the leash loose. The bell tower stairs began behind a narrow door near the rear of the sanctuary. Rowan tested the first few steps with his weight and frowned. "Old wood," he said. "Old everything," Tessa replied. "That's why we came." "One at a time," Rowan said, "and nobody touches anything before I photograph it." June lifted her thermos. "Can I touch coffee?" "That may be essential to public safety." The climb was cramped and steep. Nolan went first to check the steps, then Rowan, then Tessa with her satchel, Evelyn carefully behind her, June muttering about saints who built towers without elevators, and Harlan last only as far as the first landing. His knees would not take the full climb, and he hated that more than the stairs. Bracken did not climb. The steps were too narrow for his hip. He stayed below with Harlan, sitting at the base of the tower door like an appointed guard. The bell chamber was colder than outside. Wind slipped through gaps in the wooden louvers. Dust lay thick over beams, rope, and the old bronze bell hanging from a heavy frame. The bell itself was larger than Nolan expected, greened with age at the edges, its surface marked with faint lettering he could not read. For 2 hours they searched. Tessa photographed every symbol she found. Evelyn checked the beam joints and old storage niches. Rowan documented everything with the patience of a man trying to make future lawyers miserable. Nolan climbed where others could not, tested panels, ran gloved fingers along cracks, looked behind loose boards and inside a broken cabinet. They found dead insects, a cracked hymnal, 3 rusted nails, a raccoon nest old enough to have historical significance, according to Tessa. They did not find a beeswax tube. By noon, the cold had settled into Nolan's knees and hands. Evelyn's breath showed in faint white puffs as she studied Marin's copied map again. "This may not be the right bell," she said. "There's only one bell," Tessa answered. "Then the reference may be symbolic." June leaned against a beam. "I hate symbolic. Symbolic never helps shovel a driveway." Below, Harlan called up, his voice thin through the stairwell. "Any luck?" No one answered immediately. That was answer enough. Nolan looked at the bell, then at the beams, then at the empty corners they had searched twice. His chest tightened, not with anger this time, but with a heavier thing. Hope, when it had nowhere to stand, became cruel. He had let himself believe, not fully. He knew better than fully, but enough. Enough to imagine Marin had left a trail that could still be followed. Enough to imagine old paper surviving flood, neglect, and greed because she had believed it might. If they were wrong, then what did he have? A beautiful story. A burned shed. A town that might still sell itself because stories could not pay oil bills. He climbed down without speaking. At the base of the stairs, Harlan sat on a low bench, cane across his knees. Bracken was beside him, head lifted. "I'm sorry," Harlan said before Nolan could speak. "I was so sure," Nolan shook his head. "You told us what you remembered." "That doesn't make it useful." "No," Nolan said quietly, "but it makes it honest." The old man looked away, ashamed anyway. In the sanctuary, June poured coffee into the thermos cap and handed it to Harlan. Evelyn came down last, her face controlled but pale with cold and disappointment. Tessa followed, brushing dust from her sleeve with unnecessary violence. "We have enough to keep looking," Evelyn said, though she sounded like she was speaking to herself. Nolan looked toward the altar. A strip of colored light from the stained glass had fallen across the floor. Blue, red, gold. Marin used to say churches were proof that people once believed light deserved architecture. He almost laughed at the memory, but his throat would not allow it. Then Bracken stood. The movement was slow, deliberate. He walked away from Harlan and into the center aisle, stopping beneath the open shaft of the bell tower. His head tilted upward. His nose worked the air. He was not tracking scent, Nolan realized. Not exactly. He was listening. "Bracken," Nolan said softly. The old shepherd sat. Then he howled. It was not loud at first. It rose from deep in his chest, a long, low sound that filled the empty church and climbed the tower. It was grief and command together, a note from some ancient battlefield where dogs had guarded kings, shepherds, widows, and foolish men who needed saving from themselves. The sound moved through the stones. Up in the tower the bell answered, not with a ring, a tremor. A faint vibration passed through the old frame overhead. Dust sifted down in a thin veil. Somewhere above, something knocked softly against wood. Tessa's head snapped up. "Do that again," she said. Nolan stared at her. "You're asking the dog?" "I am asking anyone in this building capable of producing useful acoustics." Bracken drew in breath and howled again. This time Nolan heard it clearly. A small rattle above them, not from the bell itself, but from the crossbeam supporting it. Tessa was already moving for the stairs. "Gear and pine," she called down. "There's a mark on the upper brace. We missed it because we were looking at eye level like idiots with neck limitations." Rowan swore softly and followed. Nolan climbed after them, heart beating hard. In the bell chamber, Tessa pointed to the underside of a heavy horizontal beam above the bell yoke. Dust had hidden most of the carving, but when Rowan brushed it carefully with a gloved hand, the symbol appeared. A pine tree. A gear. Small. Deliberate. Waiting. The beam was not solid. Nolan could see the seam now, a hairline gap along one side. Whoever had made it had been careful, not hiding treasure from thieves, but protecting paper from water, rot, and forgetfulness. Rowan photographed it. Tessa sketched the placement. Evelyn climbed high enough to see and gave one sharp nod. "Open it," she said. Nolan worked slowly with Tessa's smallest screwdriver and an old chisel from Rowan's kit. The panel resisted, then loosened with a sigh so dry it seemed older than everyone in the room. Inside lay a cylinder wrapped in darkened beeswax cloth. No one spoke. Nolan lifted it with both hands. It was light, far too light for the weight it carried. They brought it down into the sanctuary before unwrapping it. Rowan recorded video. Evelyn set clean cloth on a pew. Tessa photographed each step. Harlan stood with both hands on his cane, trembling so hard June moved closer without saying anything. The wax cloth cracked as Evelyn peeled it away. Inside was a sealed packet of papers, brittle but dry. The original charter, a boundary map, a list of founding households. A set of minutes dated April 1952 stating that no transfer of community mill land to a commercial entity could occur without a public vote of resident stakeholders. Evelyn did not smile, but her eyes changed. "This is enough for an emergency injunction," she said. "Not a final win, but enough to stop him from moving quietly." June exhaled. "I'll take" quietly stopped. Harlan lowered himself onto the nearest pew and covered his face. "My father wasn't making it up," he whispered. "No," Nolan said. "He wasn't." Then Tessa found the photograph. It had been tucked between the charter and the map, protected by folded paper. The edges had yellowed, but the image was clear enough. Marin sat outside a rehabilitation kennel, younger, hair tied back, wearing a denim shirt and olive vest. Beside her sat Bracken, not yet silver-muzzled, younger and stronger, one ear already torn. Marin had one hand on his chest. Bracken looked not at the camera, but at her. Nolan turned the photo over. In Marin's handwriting, Bracken remembers the places people forget. Nolan does too. He just needs time. The church blurred. Nolan pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes, but the tears came anyway. Quietly, without spectacle. He did not collapse. He did not make a sound. He simply stood in the cold church, holding proof that Marin had known him in all his ruin and had still trusted time to do what force could not. June's voice came from beside him, softer than usual. She always did hate being wrong. Nolan laughed once through the tears. She wasn't. No, June said. Annoying habit? Outside, tires crunched over snow. Rowan looked toward the door. Through the narrow window, a dark SUV stopped at the bottom of the church steps. Leland Cross stepped out with a man in a navy overcoat carrying a leather briefcase. The man's posture announced lawyer before his mouth ever could. Leland came into the church without brushing snow from his boots. His gaze moved across the sanctuary. Rowan's camera, Evelyn's folder, Tessa's phone, Harlan's pale face, the open wax cloth, and finally the papers. For the first time since Nolan had met him, Leland looked less polished, only for a second. Then the smile returned. "Well," he said, "I see we found another relic." Evelyn stepped in front of the pew where the papers lay. "You are not touching these." "I wouldn't dream of it." Leland nodded to the man beside him. "Mr. Harrow, counsel for my development group." The lawyer gave a small, bloodless smile. Leland looked around the old church. "A dramatic setting. I can see why Marin loved it, but old paper does not make a town solvent." "No," Evelyn said, "but it can make your contracts contestable." His eyes cooled. "Do you know what litigation costs?" Leland asked, turning slightly so everyone could hear. "Do you know what delay costs? Roofs will still leak. Taxes will still come due. Jobs will still leave. You are offering these people nostalgia wrapped in wax." Harlan flinched. June stepped forward. "And you're offering them eviction wrapped in cashmere." Leland ignored her. His attention settled on Nolan. "You think you're honoring your wife," he said. But Marin was a dreamer. She loved this place so much she couldn't admit it did not know how to save itself. Nolan felt the words hit. They hurt, but they did not move him forward this time. Bracken stood at his side, calm and watchful. Nolan looked down at the photograph in his hand, then back at Leland. "She knew exactly how," he said. "She just didn't think one man should get to decide for everyone." For a moment, the church held them all. The investor, the sheriff, the lawyer, the archivist, the old millboy, the friend, the widower, and the dog who had sung the truth out of wood. Rowan broke the silence. "These documents are now part of an active inquiry," he said, voice rough but steady. "I'm taking custody for preservation and certified duplication. Chain of custody starts here." Leland's lawyer opened his mouth. Rowan looked at him. "You can file whatever you want after I finish my report." It was not thunder. It was not victory. It was a small official sentence spoken in a cold church by a tired man, finally standing where his badge required him to stand. Evelyn nodded once. "I will prepare an emergency filing." Tessa was already backing up photographs to 2 devices and muttering about cloud storage as if invoking a minor god. June leaned toward Nolan, holding her thermos like a sacred weapon. "Marin would be furious," she whispered. Nolan wiped his face. "Why?" "You climbed around a bell tower without gloves." The laugh that came out of him cracked in the middle, but it was real. Bracken leaned against his leg. Outside, snow slid from the church roof in a soft rush. Sunlight struck the falling powder, and for one brief moment, the air beside St. Anselm's looked filled with gold. Nolan held the photograph carefully. For the first time since Marin died, her absence did not feel like a locked room. It felt like a path someone had cleared before the snow came down. The town hall still had no power. Its white clapboard walls stood dark beneath a roof heavy with snow, and the little flag out front snapped in the wind as if it had been left to argue alone. Rowan had suggested postponing the meeting until the lights came back. Evelyn had said delay was exactly what Cross wanted. June had said if people could gather for bingo in worse weather, they could gather for the future of their own houses. So by 5 o'clock, the old sawmill was glowing again, not with electricity, with lanterns. They hung from beams, sat on work tables, swung gently from hooks in the draft. Their light turned the cavernous mill shed amber and shadowed, revealing old saw marks in the floor, rusted pulleys near the rafters, and the broad black mouth where logs had once been fed into steel teeth. Snow lay thick outside the long windows. Inside, breath fogged the glass until the whole town seemed to be breathing against the cold together. People arrived carrying folding chairs, thermoses, pies, suspicion, and the weary silence of those who had been asked too often to believe. Nolan stood near the front, one hand resting lightly on Bracken's collar. He had worn his olive field jacket over a dark flannel shirt, not the combat shirt. He had chosen it deliberately. Tonight was not a raid. He did not want to look like a man arriving to take command. He wanted, if possible, to look like someone who had finally remembered he was a neighbor. Bracken wore his old leather collar and a practical gray winter coat Dr. Amos had dropped off that afternoon with joint supplements and a warning not to let the dog become a mascot for human nonsense. Bracken had accepted the coat with the grave suffering of a monarch forced into ceremonial robes. June came through the side door carrying a tray of mugs. "If anyone starts shouting," she told Nolan, "I'm throwing coffee. Not hot enough to injure. Hot enough to educate." "I'll try not to be first." "I'd appreciate that. I only brought one thermos." Across the room, Evelyn arranged the documents on a long table beneath 2 lanterns. She had made certified copies that morning, placed the originals under Rowan's custody, and prepared a brief summary written in plain language because, as Tessa put it, legal English was invented by people afraid of being understood. Tessa herself had pinned enlarged photographs of the old charter, boundary map, mill symbols, and meeting minutes to a board. She moved briskly, loop bouncing against her chest, hair sticking up on one side from static and impatience. Harlan Vossler sat near the front wrapped in a plaid coat, cane across his knees. His face looked pale but determined. Beside him were 2 older men Nolan vaguely recognized from the Lower Bridge neighborhood, both former mill families, both looking as if they had not decided whether memory was a blessing or a trap. Rowan stood near the door in uniform. That mattered. Nolan saw people notice. The sheriff was not hiding in the back, not pretending this was someone else's problem. He held a folder under one arm, shoulders stiff, eyes moving over the crowd with a kind of tired resolve. Then Leland Cross arrived. No lawyer this time, no briefcase. Just Leland in a navy parka and dark gloves, clean against the old mill's dust. He entered quietly, greeted several people by name, shook hands with a woman near the stove, bent to listen to a man whose chimney had cracked in the storm. He did not look like an invader. That was what made him dangerous. He knew how to stand among people as if he had always belonged there, even while measuring what could be taken from under their feet. At 6, Rowan stepped forward. "We're here," he said, voice carrying unevenly through the mill, "to discuss newly recovered historical documents related to the Brightwater Gap Community Land Trust and current property transfers connected to the proposed ridge development." Someone muttered, "We know why we're here." Rowan looked toward the voice but did not challenge it. "Good," he said. "Then let's do it plainly." That earned him a few surprised glances. Evelyn spoke first. She did not dramatize anything. She explained the charter, the boundary map, the old meeting minutes, and what they did and did not mean. Her words were precise, but she kept them human. "No court has ruled," she said. "No one should leave tonight believing the matter is finished. What we have is enough to file for an emergency pause on certain transfers, enough to require a legal review, enough perhaps to prove that this land was never meant to be sold out from under residents without a public vote." A woman near the back raised her hand. Her name was Ruth Bellamy, Nolan remembered. She ran a small bookkeeping service from her kitchen and had a husband on oxygen. "Pause for how long?" Ruth asked. "Because bills don't pause." A few people murmured agreement. Evelyn nodded. "That is fair." Leland watched silently. Nolan noticed how still he had become. Tessa stepped up next and showed the old symbols. She spoke about ledgers, flood records, and the pine and gear mark found in multiple places. Harlan confirmed what he remembered of his father's work at the mill. His voice shook at first, then strengthened. "My father always said the mill wasn't just lumber," Harlan told them. "It was how people kept one another from falling through winter." An older man in the second row looked away quickly. Not everyone wanted to be moved. After Harlan, Rowan cleared his throat. "I'll say my part," he said. "Some property agreements currently under discussion may be affected by these records. I am advising residents not to sign new contracts until independent counsel reviews the matter. If anyone feels pressured, misled, or threatened, my office will take a statement." June muttered, "Look at that. Government in motion." Rowan ignored her, but his ears reddened. Then Nolan's turn came. He had faced rooms full of officers, briefed missions, spoken into darkness while men waited for orders. But standing in front of neighbors was harder. Soldiers expected fear. Civilians hid it in folded arms, unpaid bills, and polite distrust. Nolan looked down at Bracken. The old dog sat beside him, calm in the lantern light. Nolan began without raising his voice. "Marin loved this place," he said. The room shifted, not softened, shifted. She didn't love it because it was perfect. She knew the roofs leaked. She knew half the pipes in town were older than good judgment. She knew people left because staying got hard. A few people smiled faintly. She loved it because Brightwater Gap remembered people, or it used to. The men who cut lumber here, the women who kept shops open through storms, the veterans who came home and didn't know how to say they were scared, the widows who shared firewood before they asked for help themselves. His voice caught slightly. He let it. For once, he did not punish himself for being heard. Marin believed development wasn't the enemy, forgetting was. He took the folded paper from his pocket, one of Marin's notes, worn now at the crease. She left a plan, not a perfect one, not a magic one. A beginning. Leland's expression changed, just a fraction. There it was, Nolan thought, the first thing he had not expected. Nolan unfolded the page. Marin's plan was not romantic in the way people expected dead women's plans to be. It had cost estimates, repair priorities, ownership models, grant possibilities, and names of people who could help. It suggested turning part of the old sawmill into a winter emergency center and cooperative workshop. It proposed using vacant homes as locally owned guest cottages instead of selling them to outside investors. It suggested opening Nolan and Marin's unfinished house as a small warming station during deep storms, with future space for retired working dogs and veterans who needed quiet, not ceremony. "It's small," Nolan said. "Slow, probably irritating. It needs permits, money, labor, and people willing to sit through meetings worse than this one." That earned a tired laugh. "But it doesn't require anyone here to become a stranger in their own town." For a moment, the mill held still. Then Leland stood. He did not clap slowly. He did not sneer. He simply rose with the composed sadness of a man prepared to be reasonable in public. "Nolan," he said, "that was moving, truly." June whispered, "Duck, compliment incoming." Leland turned to the crowd. "I grew up here too." Some of you remember my mother keeping blankets over the windows because the house wouldn't hold heat. Some of you remember my father borrowing money he never paid back. Some of you remember me wearing boots with cardboard in the soles. No one interrupted. My point is not to shame anyone. My point is that poverty becomes charming only after people escape it. The words landed hard. Leland walked slowly between the rows, not pacing like a predator, but like a man inviting confession. This town is tired. You know it. I know it. Marin knew it too, whether she admitted it or not. The development I'm proposing means jobs, road repairs, tax revenue, customers for businesses that are dying one winter at a time. He pointed gently toward Nolan's paper. A cooperative dream will not fix Mrs. Bellamy's furnace. It will not pay medical bills. It will not bring back the young people who left. Nostalgia is warm for about 10 minutes. Then the oil tank runs dry. Ruth Bellamy lowered her eyes. So did others. Nolan felt the room tilt toward Leland, not because Leland was kind, but because need was a powerful priest. It could make almost any altar look holy. Nolan wanted to answer quickly. Bracken's head turned toward him. Not a warning this time. A reminder. Slow. Nolan looked at Ruth. Mrs. Bellamy, he said, did Cross offer to fix your furnace? She looked startled. He offered to buy the house. That's not the same thing. No, she whispered. It isn't. Nolan faced the room again. I'm not asking anyone to choose memory over heat. I'm asking why the only help being offered requires you to leave. The words did not win the room. They opened it. That was enough. People began speaking, not in order, not politely at first. A man admitted he had signed because his roof had collapsed over the back bedroom. A woman said she wanted the development because her son might come back if there were jobs. Another said her mother's house had been in the family since 1948, but she could not afford the taxes. Someone else accused Nolan of interfering because he had military retirement and did not understand being trapped. Nolan took that one without defending himself. June looked ready to defend him with a chair. Evelyn stopped her with one raised hand. The meeting became less clean and more honest. Tessa wrote concerns on a chalkboard. Heating assistance, legal review, tax relief, local jobs, cooperative ownership, emergency repairs. Rowan took down names of those who felt pressured. Evelyn offered to organize volunteer legal consultations with 2 attorneys she still trusted, though she said the word trusted as if lending it money. Then Dr. Amos appeared near the side entrance, snow on his boots and a medical bag in hand. Nolan hadn't known he was coming. Amos stood without speaking until several people turned. I heard my name used dangerously near a plan, he said. So I came to prevent exaggeration. A small laugh moved through the room. He was blunt, practical, and mercifully unsentimental. He said a retired working dog and veteran support program would not be easy. It would need insurance, veterinary partnerships, transport arrangements, and proper trauma protocols. It could begin with 1 heated room, 1 monthly clinic, and volunteers trained to stop calling every nervous dog broken. Then Amos looked at Bracken. But it can begin. That did something Nolan's speech had not. It made Marin's idea smaller, and because it was smaller, people could touch it. June placed Marin's blue-gray scarf on the low platform beside Nolan. She had brought it from the house, folded in a paper bag without asking. Nolan almost objected. Then Bracken walked forward. The old shepherd lowered himself beside the scarf with a long sigh, resting his muzzle near the wool. No trick. No miracle. Just a tired dog choosing the scent of the woman who had once helped him survive. The room quieted. Not because everyone believed, because for one breath nobody wanted to be the person who spoke over that. Harlan's voice came from the front row. I vote we stop signing anything until we know what belongs to who. It's to whom, Tessa said automatically. Harlan looked at her. At my age, I'll dangle every preposition I please. This time, the laughter was easier. Rowan called the vote in 3 parts, as Evelyn had advised. First, temporary pause on new development-related transfers until legal review. Hands rose. Not all. Enough. Second, formation of a resident committee to verify the land trust and negotiate any future development publicly. More hands. A few reluctant. A few shaking. Enough. Third, formal review of Marin's community plan as an alternative proposal, including sawmill reuse, local guest house ownership, winter emergency support, and a pilot working dog recovery partnership with Dr. Amos. This vote took longer. People looked at one another. Some whispered. Ruth Bellamy stared at her hands for several seconds before raising one. Then another hand rose. Then another. Not unanimous, not triumphant, but real. Leland stood at the back of the mill, face unreadable in lantern light. He did not storm out. He put on his gloves, adjusted his coat, and said to no one in particular, "Delay has a cost." Evelyn replied, "So does silence." He looked at her, then at Nolan, then at Bracken. For the first time, Nolan saw no smile at all. Leland left through the side door. Cold air swept in behind him, lifting the edges of Marin's scarf. Bracken raised his head, but did not follow. The meeting broke slowly after that. People lingered in clusters, not celebrating. Talking, arguing, asking questions, offering tools, spare rooms, names of relatives who knew grant writing, names of lawyers, names of people who would absolutely complain, but might still help. Nolan stood near the platform, exhausted. June came up beside him. "Well," she said, "no one threw pie." "That the standard?" "In this town, that's almost statesmanship." Evelyn gathered her folders. "We file tomorrow." Rowan nodded. "I'll have statements ready." Tessa pointed at Nolan. "You owe me 3 archive boxes and an apology for every time you thought history was boring." "I never said history was boring." "You had the face." Amos crouched to check Bracken's hip. "He needs rest." "So do I," Nolan said. Amos looked up. "I was speaking to the intelligent one." Later, Nolan drove home with Bracken asleep in the passenger seat, chin heavy on the folded scarf. Snowbanks glowed beneath the moon. The town behind them remained uncertain, divided, frightened, but it was no longer silent. At home, Nolan built a fire. He expected relief. Instead, he felt the long road ahead. Court filings, repairs, anger, winter, money they did not have, faith they would have to keep rebuilding every time fear knocked it down. Still, when the first flames caught, he did not sit across from grief like a prisoner facing a guard. He fed it carefully, wood by wood, memory by memory, until the room grew warm. Winter did not leave Brightwater Gap all at once. It retreated the way grief did, stubbornly, unevenly, leaving behind drifts in shaded places long after the roads had cleared. Snow still clung to the north side of roofs. Ice still hung from porch gutters in glassy teeth. At night, the cold came back hard enough to remind everyone that spring was only a rumor people told themselves for courage. But the great storm had passed, and something in the town had changed. Not everything. Not enough to make a postcard out of it. Leland Cross did not disappear in disgrace beneath a thunderclap of justice. His lawyers filed objections within the week. Evelyn Hartwell spent long mornings at the county records office, hunting through tax rolls, trustee names, deed books, and maps so brittle they had to be handled like sleeping birds. Sheriff Rowan Teague took statements from residents who had felt pressured, then endured phone calls from officials who suddenly cared a great deal about economic momentum. Some people still regretted voting to pause the contracts. Some people whispered that Nolan Rusk had brought trouble to town because grief needed a hobby. Some people looked at the old sawmill and saw hope. Others saw an expensive building with a bad roof. Brightwater Gap had not become a family overnight. Families were not made from one meeting and a lantern-lit vote. They were made from showing up the next morning when the floor still needed sweeping. Nolan started with the porch. It seemed almost foolish, after court filings and burned sheds and hidden charters, to stand on a ladder with a hammer in his hand, replacing warped boards one by one. But the porch roof had needed fixing since October. Maren had circled it in red on a list still pinned near the kitchen door. Porch before heavy snow, she had written. Then, beneath it, yes, Nolan. This means before, not during. He read that line every morning while drinking coffee that remained, according to June Whitaker, a misdemeanor in liquid form. By the third day, June arrived with soup, bread, and 2 opinions about his carpentry. "The beam's crooked," she said from the yard. "The house is crooked." "The house has character, you have excuses." Bracken lay on an old blanket near the steps, wearing his gray winter coat and watching Nolan with the solemn disappointment of a foreman who could not believe what humans charged for labor. June set the soup on the porch rail and pointed at the dog. "He agrees with me." "He agrees with anyone carrying food." "That's called wisdom." A week later, Tessa Vale came up the hill carrying a wall clock wrapped in a towel. It was round, dark wood, with a cracked face and brass hands that had stopped at 417 sometime in another century. She marched past Nolan without asking permission and hung it in the front room. "A house trying to live again needs to know what time it is," she said. "It doesn't work." "Neither did you initially." Nolan looked at her. Tessa adjusted the clock, then wound it. After a stubborn pause, it began ticking. "There," she said. "Now both of you are under supervision." Bracken sneezed from Maren's chair. Dr. Amos Kittredge set up the first monthly clinic in what had once been Maren's storage room. Nolan cleared out broken chairs, old paint, and boxes of things he had not been ready to touch. Amos brought a folding exam table, joint supplements, ear wash, a scale, vaccination forms, and a handwritten sign that said, "Old dogs, working dogs, stubborn dogs, and the humans attached to them." The first patient was a 12-year-old Labrador with cloudy eyes and a tail that thumped whenever anyone said biscuit. The second was a retired patrol dog with a scar across his nose and a handler who stood too straight, spoke too little, and relaxed only when Bracken came over and sat beside him. Nolan watched from the doorway. He had thought helping would feel grander. It mostly involved sweeping fur, holding bowls, fixing a heater, and listening when men who did not want to talk found reasons to stay another 10 minutes. That was how beginnings often disguised themselves, not as trumpets, but as errands. Evelyn used Nolan's kitchen table as a legal command post twice a week. She spread folders across it with the authority of an occupying army and complained about his coffee every time. "This tastes like mud that attended boot camp," she said one morning. June already used that one. "Then June and I are aligned with the evidence." Rowan came by with updates when he could. He never stayed long. He stood near the door, hat in hand, and reported in careful sentences. Which residents had requested contract review, which transfer filings had been flagged, which county clerk had found a tax notation from 1963. Each time he seemed a little less like a man apologizing for having a badge. Then, in late February, Abner Pike came home for a visit. The community had raised enough money to move him to a smaller care facility closer to Brightwater Gap. Not home, not exactly, but near enough that June could bring him soup, and Tessa could fix the clock in the common room, and Nolan could drive Bracken down on clear days. The first visit happened at Maren House, though Nolan had not yet said the name aloud to many people. Abner arrived in a wheelchair pushed by a nurse with kind eyes and bright purple gloves. He looked smaller than he had beneath the maple tree, wrapped in a blanket, cap pulled low, cheeks pale from indoor air. But when he saw Bracken, something lit behind his cloudy eyes. "Well," Abner said, voice rough. "Look at you, old soldier." Bracken crossed the room slowly. No rush, no dramatic leap. His hip would not have tolerated one, and his dignity would have forbidden it. He reached Abner's chair and placed his head carefully in the old man's lap. Abner's trembling hands settled over the silver muzzle. For a while, no one spoke. Nolan stood near the doorway, feeling the quiet gather around them like a shawl. He had once believed love meant holding on until your hands bled. But Abner had loved Bracken enough to let him go. Marin had loved Nolan enough to leave him a path he would not have chosen for himself. Bracken had loved them all in the only language he owned: staying, watching, returning. Abner wiped his eyes with 2 fingers. "You taking care of him?" he asked. Nolan nodded. "He's taking care of me, too." Abner gave a small, satisfied grunt. "That sounds like him." By March, the court granted a temporary order preserving the disputed trust parcels while the records were fully reviewed. It was not a final victory. Evelyn made sure no one called it that in her presence. "A foundation is not a house," she said. "Stand on it too proudly, and you'll fall through the floor." But it was enough to stop several rushed transfers, enough to force Leland's development group into public negotiation, enough for a few smaller investors to approach the town with cooperative proposals instead of acquisition contracts. Enough for residents to understand they were not powerless simply because they were tired. Leland still appeared at meetings, polished and controlled, but the room had changed around him. People asked for terms in writing. They requested independent review. They said, "We'll discuss that as a town." And the words sounded strange at first, then less strange each time. The old sawmill did not become a center overnight. Its roof leaked in 2 places. The furnace needed replacement, and one wall had a family of raccoons with strong ancestral claims. But volunteers cleared one section. Someone donated lumber. Someone else brought an ancient coffee urn that worked only if spoken to kindly. Harlan sat in a folding chair and told younger volunteers where the old loading doors had been, though everyone present was over 40, and Tessa insisted that younger was becoming an increasingly generous legal fiction. At Nolan's house, the blue door was repainted. June chose the color because Nolan said he did not care, which she correctly interpreted as an emergency requiring intervention. It was close to the old blue Marin had loved, but a little brighter. "Not cheerful," Nolan said. "Cheerful adjacent," June replied. "You'll survive." The name came quietly. Marin House. At first, Nolan wrote it only on a piece of paper and taped it inside the mudroom. Then Tessa made a proper sign from salvaged wood. Evelyn objected to the font. June objected to Evelyn. Amos objected to the fact that nobody had asked whether the sign should include clinic hours. Bracken inspected the whole argument, then lay down beneath the sign as if declaring it legally sufficient. On the wall inside, Nolan hung the photograph from St. Anselm's, Marin Younger, smiling faintly beside Bracken, her hand resting on his chest. Beneath it, Tessa printed a line from one of Marin's notes and framed it. Things left behind are not always finished. The house began to fill in small ways. A veteran from 2 towns over came to sit by the stove with his retired hound and said almost nothing for an hour. A widow from the lower bridge brought apple bread and stayed to label donated blankets. Ruth Bellamy came with her husband's portable oxygen tank and a folder of bills, and Evelyn helped her contact a heating assistance program before any legal strategy could call itself moral. Rowan dropped off firewood without comment. Amos vaccinated 3 dogs and scolded 4 humans. June kept feeding people as if soup were a form of town governance. Nolan still had bad nights. So did Bracken. Sometimes wind struck the house, and Bracken woke with a low growl, body rigid, eyes searching for a war that had not followed him home. Sometimes Nolan woke reaching for Marin and found only darkness and the blunt ache of remembering. But now, when one woke, the other did too. Nolan would sit on the floor with his back against the bed, one hand on Bracken's neck. Or Bracken would press his weight against Nolan's knee until breathing became possible again. They did not cure each other. They kept watch. One morning in late March, while searching the toolbox for a hinge, Nolan found the cassette. It had slipped behind a tray of screws in the old wooden box Marin used for small repairs. A strip of blue painter's tape crossed the plastic case. On it, in her handwriting, was one word: Nolan. He sat down before opening it. His hands did not shake as badly as they once would have. That frightened him for a moment. Then he understood. Healing did not mean the dead mattered less. It meant the living could carry them without bleeding on every step. The old player sat on a shelf in the pantry. It took 3 tries before the tape caught. Then Marin's voice filled the kitchen, thin with static, warm beneath it. If you found this, you're probably pretending you were looking for a hinge or a nail or some other very serious object. Hello, my love. Nolan laughed once, then covered his mouth. Bracken lifted his head from the rug. Marin continued. You may grieve longer than winter, Nolan. I know you. You are very committed once you choose a terrible plan. But don't grieve alone forever. If Bracken is there, listen to him. He has always been better at finding the way back than we are. The tape hissed. I wanted to tell you everything when I had proof. I wanted to hand you certainty, not another burden. If I failed at that, forgive me. But if this house is open, if there is noise in the kitchen, if someone has complained about your coffee, then maybe we still won in the only way that matters. A pause. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. Do not make a shrine of me. Make a door. The tape clicked off. Nolan sat in the quiet for a long time. Outside, sunlight scattered across the snow in the yard. The repaired porch cast a clean shadow. The blue door glowed against the old timber house, not cheerful exactly, but no longer afraid of being seen. Bracken came to him and touched his muzzle to Nolan's hand. Later, Nolan carried 2 mugs of coffee onto the porch, one for himself and one he forgot no one else would drink. He left the second on the rail anyway. Bracken sat beside him, silver muzzle bright in the morning light, old collar cleaned but not replaced, the scratches still visible like a map of everything he had survived. Nolan looked down the hill toward Brightwater Gap. Smoke rose from chimneys. A truck moved slowly along the road. Somewhere in town, the sawmill doors would be open. Someone would be arguing with Tessa about labels. June would be insulting breakfast. Evelyn would be making paper behave. Rowan would be trying to become the sheriff he had always meant to be. Amos would be telling a man that a nervous dog was not broken, only listening too hard to the past. Nolan finally understood. Marin hadn't left him a mystery to solve. She had left him a way to live, not revenge, not victory polished clean enough for a monument, just care. For an old dog, an old house, a tired town, the frozen part of his own heart that had not died after all. Bracken rested his head on Nolan's knee. The gesture was small. No choir rose, no bell rang, no crowd applauded. But Nolan felt something open inside him that had been locked since the icy road took Marin away. He placed his hand on Bracken's head. You weren't left behind, he whispered. Bracken's tail moved once against the porch boards. Slow, certain. Nolan smiled through the ache. Yeah, he said, I'm starting to understand. And below them, Brightwater Gap kept breathing. Not saved, not finished. Still writing itself into morning. Sometimes healing does not arrive like a grand miracle. Sometimes it comes as an old dog at a winter market, a forgotten letter in a wall, a neighbor who refuses to let you disappear, or a door you finally choose to open again. Nolan did not erase his grief. He learned to give it a place by the fire. And Bracken reminded him that what the world calls left behind may still be carrying a purpose only love can see. May we all have the courage to open the door when hope knocks softly. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe stories like this still matter, please subscribe and stay with us for the next one. May peace find your home, even after the hardest storms.